People begged me to ask this forever though. I'm not expecting a long answer to this one though, but I just have to do it for the community's sake.
Okay, I will try and deliver a short answer.
Did Magnus do nothing
Do
wrong?
anything wrong?
Hello everyone, welcome as a special episode today. I'm joined by perhaps someone who's very much a god amongst men in our circles though. He is just a regular dude, but we're going to talk about something really incredibly special to me, which is Thousand Sons lore and Magnus the Red in particular. It's a character that I have a love-hate relationship with because I feel so disappointed at Magnus. But before we get onto that, there's just one quick throw-out question to my collaborator here, Mr. Graham McNeill, who, thank you so much for joining us. But the first question is a bit of it's to set the mood for this, which is Kentaro Miura, the author of Berserk, has spoken about how his works have drastically changed as he's matured. And I wanted to ask you, in what ways do you think your writing has changed compared to when, a few decades ago when you first started writing Warhammer to how you write now? It's obviously a big thing in the Berserk series, massive changes from the beginning to how it sort of currently is before obviously the author passed away. And I was wondering for you, Graham, how much, so if you were starting to write Warhammer today though, how much do you think your writing has changed compared to when you first started?
So, we're starting with the easy questions.
First.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to. I mean, you as a writer change over the years. I mean, you're every day you're a new person. Every day you've experienced something else that has, big or small, that will affect you in some way. So, like when I started out writing professionally, I, was not married, was not a father, was living in the UK, kind of where I always had. I've learned from the act of writing something teaches you about the process, about what you're good at, what you need some work at, what you enjoy, what you don't like, what the readers respond to. So it's a continually iterative process where you're learning everything, learning a lot about you as a person, you as a creator as you go along. And, as you get older, your perspectives on things do change. The world changes around you. You appreciate things differently or more, or suddenly you think, oh, actually, I don't really like that anymore. Or whatever it is, your skill hopefully grows technically. I remember many years ago when Black Library were wanting to release, they did a special edition of Nightbringer for, I want to say it was the 20th anniversary, but I think it was before that. It was like a Masterworks edition or something like that.
20th anniversary, I think it was.
And they offered me the chance to say, hey, do you want to go back into the book and, sort of retool bits or do anything to that you would, like you say, you've grown and changed in writers, anything, because that was your first novel, is anything you want to do to it? And at first, my initial thought was, oh, yeah, that'd be great. But then when I thought about it a little more, I was like, you know what? Yeah, I could go back and I'm sure I could improve elements of it, like the pacing, the technical moments for moment, bits of the sentence structures, yada, yada. But I was like, no, I like it as it is. It's very much, it's a time capsule of who I was as a writer back in 2002. And I don't think I want to change it, because then it becomes like, well, which version have you got? Have you got the proper version or the not so proper version? And I was like, no, I don't like futzing with things. Once it's published and it's in the reader's hands, it is the book it is. And I don't like going back to tinker with things. But yeah, as I've become more aware of, raising children, being a husband, being in this world as it slides into crazy town, you have to become a bit more aware of the world, and that can't help but seep into your writing unconsciously or deliberately and so on. Whether you're wanting to make a point about something in the world, or whether it's just something you're feeling that just comes out in how you view the characters or the setting.
I think often when particularly writers, they talk about the thing that really influences their work more than anything is just, it is becoming a parent. And I think it's one of those, I'm not at that stage myself yet, but I wonder if it is one of those things where it's just a general, it's a paradigm shift focus in which you almost view things are before and after, and even it affects you creatively.
You're not the center of your world at that point. You can't be. You're every every waking moment is, concerned with keeping these small things alive.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that really has to become your focus. So, yeah, I mean, I remember talking to a bunch of horror writers at Worldcon many years ago, and they were saying how becoming a parent radically shifted their writing, because it shifted all the things that they were afraid of beforehand, were like monsters, slasher killers, whatever. Becoming a parent, suddenly it was like losing the child, being kidnapped or run over by a car or whatever it was. But the fears they had that manifested a lot in their writing changed from before kids to after kids. So, and I'm not saying that hasn't particularly I've done a lot for my writing, in the sense of, I don't write a lot of, I mean, I have written horror, but I don't like it exclusively. Or, like 40K has a lot of horrifying elements, and there is a brand of Warhammer horror, but a lot of the horror that I've written is that sort of existential horror of corruption, of the thing coming from the outside. You're not as safe as you think you are, and just turning your world upside down. In 40K, it's often, different things will do that to you, whereas a contemporary set horror.
Speaking
I'd like to think I've changed it for the better as a writer, and I've learned things. I've learned things from other writers, talking to them, from reading other people's work, seeing how they did a thing, or going back to books that I loved and going, I've got a greater skill to pick apart a book now and say, I like this because of that. I liked how they did this. And, most writers are magpies in some form or another, where they like, because, writing hacks, writing tricks, writing techniques, you take what works for you, discard the rest, and just distill it through your own personal lens. And over the years, hopefully you keep improving. I hope if I have this conversation with you in another few years, I'll be coming at it with more answers of what's changed, how I've learned, and what have you. You've always got to be open to be learning.
Speaking of things in life. Speaking of a thing that's a father and son relationship, which is basically, they always say Warhammer is basically, is it father issues, the experience though.
It's a familial drama at its core.
I very much have had I said at the beginning, like a love-hate relationship with the character Magnus, because it's in the same way like you kind of despise Erebus, because Erebus is so well written that you just, in those moments, you're like, oh, why? And with Magnus, I'm gonna go through all of the books just very briefly, just because I've got some questions about. Essentially, this was the evolution of this character that you got to kind of see. Well, in the Horus Heresy perspective, you kind of saw him beginning to end in some, in a character sense. And my first question, which is set during the Magnus the Red, Master of Prospero, which is the novella. It was about writing weaknesses for a character like Magnus, who essentially seems to be like a god amongst men. And I noticed you did this like quite poignantly in this book, when you had the moment or the scene where he experiences physical pain, like the first time when he sort of takes the tank shot, if I remember correctly. Because that was something where it was interesting to see Magnus, even in the book, it wrote how he dabbled with the idea of it or had done something in practice. But this is, essentially a young boy in a way, even though he's meant to be, he's boyish as a way of a Primarch is. They're like childlike. And I was wondering, was that a deliberate choice in that book about making sure he experiences physical weakness just because that's not really necessarily his domain?
Yeah. Well, it's like something we said earlier, that Primarchs are essentially, they're warriors first. That whatever else they have going in their story, their powers, whatever, that's kind of secondary to the notion that they are Primarchs leading armies at war. And Magnus, as a rule, kind of likes to experience everything so you can know about it. You can't know a thing, and he's very much the whole, you want to know how to do a thing, you do it, and you learn by doing. So even things like pain, discomfort, ignorance, he went through those stages of wanting to know what each of those things felt like, so that he could then be the authority on it. And that's always, which leads to his ultimate law, the hubris of, I'm the smartest person in the room, and I will do the knowing better for all of you. because you're not smart enough to know, because you haven't got all the facts. You don't know the things I know, so I'll do the knowing for you. It's all right. So there's an unintended condescension in that, which leads you to, when you think you know everything, the zealot who thinks they have the answer to everything is often the one who doesn't do the questioning. So he's got that constant push and pull of thinking he knows everything, but on the other hand, that little voice at the back of his head that's telling him, no, you don't know anything. And he always, that's this thing that drives him all the time to keep knowing things, even to the point where he probably shouldn't have gone that little bit further. When the Emperor said, don't go through that door, don't look at that thing, don't touch it, it's too dangerous. Magnus's hubris was a lot. No, I have to, because not knowing a thing is dangerous. Know thyself, know your enemy, blah, blah, blah. So he has to know this thing. Even when somebody wiser than him has told him not to, he still goes for enemy because he sees that as a weakness, not knowing a thing.
I was asking as well, about within specifically this book, because it's one of my favorite moments in generally the Horus Heresy, which was, it's the moments of brotherhood shown and shared between Magnus and Perturabo, because it's one of the few times, because obviously you've written other books in which Perturabo was again the main character and star of the show, and it was interesting to see, in a way, these two characters that are so much they were almost so above being or having a normal human interaction like some of the other Primarchs. That was there a deliberate choice in this book to sort of have these moments where this is early Great Crusade, they're the more naive versions of themselves, so they're more willing to show human emotion, and also what was the
we're still learning it.
Also, just a small tangent on that, how did you come up with the idea of because the moments of brotherhood, there's some deep, proper loving relationship and moments spoken in word, which is often not done in Warhammer. So what was the kind of inspiration behind those things?
Well, that was a very deliberate choice. I'm glad you asked that one, because a lot of the Primarch novellas were very deliberately and rightly very action heavy. It's the Great Crusade. It's showing almost like a what could have been if things hadn't gone south. We'd have seen more of this. And I very deliberately did not want to do a book where there was an obvious enemy, in the sense of it's Magnus and Perturabo loyal and they're fighting orcs. It's that just feels like it's doing something that the Horus Heresy books do already, and the Primarch novellas, to my mind, always felt like they should be something different. They should explore a different aspect. So making this as a book where the Primarchs were helping, they were helping evacuate populace from this dying world and so on. So it felt like a different, it was an antagonist that couldn't be fought. I mean, yes, there are bad guys involved in the story because that made sense for that happening, but it was an antagonist that they had to work together to overcome, in this case, the destruction of a planet. And I always wanted to show the Primarchs, not as humans, because they're not humans, but show them in situations where we got to see why it was such a tragedy that it all fell apart. That these people, Magnus and Perturabo in many ways could not be more different, but yet they came together and they recognized that shared brotherhood, and any rivalries that might have existed between their legions in terms of how they operated, how their Primarchs thought, were put aside in the space of planetary destruction and a people that they were there to help, to save. That was ultimately the goal of the Primarch project, was to save humanity, to push the invaders back from the edge of the galaxy and claim the galaxy for humankind. That notion is somewhat, corrupted and changed over the millennia into the Dark Imperium, but the intent behind it was always noble in some ways of thinking, especially in the Emperor's long view, that saving humanity was worth any sort of cost. I really wanted to take the Primarchs back to places where they got to do things that we didn't see them do all the time, because we've seen them in the Horus Heresy novels do all the things we, quote unquote, expect of them. So this felt like an opportunity to do things that were different, that were interesting, and were ways of showing them that we hadn't seen before. So that's a very deliberate plan to do that. Yeah.
I like that novel particularly just because it almost showed like, like it's the glory days part where even despite not obviously spoiling it for those who haven't seen it or read it yet, but it was nice to see Magnus and Perturabo actually perceived as the heroes and how Primarchs were during a time in which they, it's not just all fighting the eternal civil war. It was actually just, oh, that's why people respected Magnus the Red, though. But unfortunately, it's going to get a bit downhill now for Magnus because
it is a little bit. Even the very ending of that book, again, without spoiling it, Magnus makes the kind of decision that you would normally expect coming from Perturabo. And it was just a sort of little sting in the tail reminder of, this isn't going to last. This bucolic brotherhood that we've done the thing and we've done what the Emperor asked us and we've succeeded, or there's been casualties, but we've done the thing that was asked of us. It's not going to last. I mean, that's the ultimate, the fragility, the beauty of it is this thing is beautiful because it won't last. And that's, even though they don't expect that, they think the Imperium is going to last. We, the reader, know,
that's quite a common theme in a lot of your story writing and your novels. Is very much there's always a bit of a brief glimpse of like, because obviously I don't want to spoil it for too many people, but there's often a lot of character death involved in your novels. You beat my poor heart, but you often do want to show readers like the kind of height. I feel that way when I was reading it, as often as like there's like an element of like deeper tragedy in which it's that thing you always go like, it's like watching Band of Brothers. I remember watching on like HBO. Like before they've landed on the beaches, and it's just like there's an element of like they always look back like those were the glory days when everyone was still together and alive, and then it goes downhill.
Well, I think with Grimdark, it needs that level, because Grimdark at one level constant, it doesn't bores me too strong, but it's not as interesting because as Grimdark as the Imperium is, and as the story can be, I think without even just a sliver of hope of something worth fighting for, then it just it verges on nihilism. And I think that the heroes, or as they see and are perceived to begin with, the heroes see that there is something worth fighting for, that there is something to be done and saved. That's largely fallen away by the time we get to the 41st millennium. But in the pre-Horus Heresy Great Crusade idea of time, it was a galaxy that could be won, a society and a civilization that would endure and do great things, hopefully. So I'll even in the 40k universe, when I write there, I always try and give some sliver of that, because the texture of the story becomes more interesting, the characters become more interesting, because if there's nothing worth fighting for, what's the point of fighting? I think I'd agree that's a common theme throughout my stuff.
I think is our beloved Mr. Dan Abnett, who said there's always room for hope with a lowercase h, never room for a capital H, hope. Which I think that's always like describing Warhammer to people is often quite difficult, but it's always the best to rely on people who are much more eloquent than me. But I might have another question here, which is starting on the Thousand Sons novel itself. This is a bit of a small one, but I have found it quite interesting, which is, how do you craft the Thousand Sons? They were essentially a group of space wizards into a fully functioning modern military in the Warhammer verse. You took them from what was, people could have said was like almost like a bit of a comedic concept, and then you turned them into something that was like functioning, real, and it was like in universe readily accepted, into obviously controversial but readily accepted. And I wonder in your mind how you felt about like turning the Thousand Sons into like, oh, this is a serious legion.
Well, it goes back to that same concept of the Primarchs, is that these are Space Marines first. Everything else they can do beyond that is an extra tool and weapon in their arsenal. Because when I was writing the first battle scenes in those books, I really wanted to make sure that they didn't feel just like another chapter who shouted something different, for Magnus instead of for Guilliman and what have you. That the magic, the psychic powers that they employed, they would work into the structure. They're, again, Astartes first. they're bound, the growing, beginnings of the Codex, what have you, the organizational structures of the legions of Astartes. Those are first and foremost their guiding principles for how they make war. But when you get Magnus and psychic powers in the mix, that adds to what you can do. When your reconnaissance troops can read the minds of the enemy around the corner, when your telekinetic troops can yank them out of cover, you incorporate that into your doctrines. So I was looking at ways that I could use, wizard powers. And what would you use that for? If you were a combat unit that had psychics that could throw fireballs or read minds and so on, how would you incorporate that into modern
military,
quote unquote, military doctrine? So, because I wanted it to feel like the psychic powers and the martial strength were woven together, and that they were like inextricable, that they wouldn't fight one without the other. So I think it's like,
it's the moment that
that's what hamstrings them
Warhammer very much.
Yeah,
like,
but when the invasion of Prospero happens, in the initial engagements, they are completely hamstrung because they're not using their psychic powers, and they've become so integral to their way of fighting that when you take that away from them, they're on the back foot, and they're losing. They're being pushed back, and that's never happened to them before. Not really, not in any significant way. So when finally, eventually, they are unleashed and allowed to use their powers, it starts going very badly for the Space Marines until, Chaos pulls the rug out from under them with tutelaries and so on. And it's like, actually, we're in charge now, and we're going to overload you with Chaos powers, and it brings the whole place down in fire and flame and death. So, yeah, definitely working it in so that it felt like this is just something they've done since day one. They've worked, psychic powers are just another tactic, another weapon that they can use to fight as effectively as they can.
I think it was really, it was so particularly awesome because when I was reading parts of the other Horus Heresy, and you see how other writers also then immediately leapt off of that, and reading Chris Wright and Scars and all the Wyatt Guard novels, when they mention parts of the Thousand Sons, they mention how they would operate in squads with each of them specializing in different members of their cults. And it was like, oh my god, the actual big brain move, the whole thing carried over, and it was recognized their eliteness in terms of, I've always wanted to ask this one because this isn't really a serious question, but Thousand Sons at full strength before the Battle of Prospero versus any other legion, do you think they could take them?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, thank God. I wanted to settle
if they were fully unleashed. It settles doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence there, but in my opinion, yes, a Thousand Sons Legion at full strength with no emotional baggage about who they were fighting. If there's another legion and there was no question that these guys are bad, we should kill them all. But I think without question, them and Magnus would just wipe the floor with pretty much anyone. Which is why Chaos was so keen to take Magnus off the board, because they knew he would be such a powerful player on the Emperor. If he stayed loyal to the Emperor, then it probably would have been a very, very different outcome to the heresy overall. So, yes, I think he could have, psychically boiled the enemy general's head in his skull, caused his lieutenants to turn on his troops, sow dissent, weave illusions. Yeah, they could have done anything they wanted to, really.
That's my only one unserious question, just because I've always wanted someone to back me up when I've said it myself.
Yeah, well, that's certainly my opinion,
Thank you. The next one is about the Council of Nikaea, which is a piece of artwork that I had commissioned. I've also sent Graham a picture of that. If anyone wants to go see it, I believe it's one of the best pieces I've ever had created for the community. And the Council of Nikaea is quite an iconic, and obviously before it's a canon event that was set in the Horus Heresy. As a writer, you're almost told you're bringing this thing to life, and yet you, in a way, have to make it your own because you want to give your spin, and you want to show the readers about why this fantastic legion is going through this incredibly tense moment that really there's certain dates throughout the Horus Heresy that just are you can point to certain dates, and this is one of the big ones. And I was wondering how you approach the scene of the Council of Nikaea in terms of like, the building. Obviously, in your mind, you were building like the set of it, the sparkling rooftop, the Colosseum, like arena in itself. Though, was that because you wanted to lean more towards the historical inspiration for it, or was that because you were like, okay, that's my base, and I'm just going to go nuts?
It was, yeah. I mean, some of it was to suggest that the Colosseum vibe. It was like the associations we have with the Colosseum. It's like one of these words which one word, but you can unpack a ton of imagery and meaning from it. So the idea was, it was almost to suggest that idea that it was like Magnus being thrown to the lions, so to speak. He was put in there to fight for his life in a sense. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the discussions we would have at workshop when we would gather to talk about the heresy and what was coming and what books we were going to do and themes to explore. One of them, we were always about what new can we bring to the table? What ideas do the readers think they know this is solid? And how can we just add layers and layers beneath that of different meanings, different scenarios that still play out in a true to the lore way, but just offers you a slightly different way of looking at things. And certainly with Thousand Suns and Prospero Burns, that's something Dan and we spoke at great length many times about how we can show a sort of Rashomon-like vibe of different people experience this moment in different ways, and how some people see it as this righteous justification for what we're doing, others as this is a trial of Magnus the Red. Different people see it different ways. But as long as we had the right canon outcome, Librariuses should be disbanded, psychic powers should no longer be used. The means by which we got to that point was pretty much up to me to decide upon. I mean, there were some things, some of the librarians spoke out in defense, others against, and so on. So those moments had to be woven in, but the emotional resonances that led up to that and were at play throughout it, that was more or less up for me to tell as I willed. But, again, talking to the other authors, and when we had our summits at workshop, we were all right, because I'm going to have this guy in my book, he's going to be at the council watching it, so maybe could you stick a line in that nods to that, and so on. Because again, it's all that connective tissue that runs between the books was something I think really made the series something special, and it gave that feeling of events aren't happening in a vacuum, that they have consequence, and other books can reference them, and you can see that, I didn't think of it in that way, but from their point of view that makes sense. But as far as the events of the book goes, I wanted it to feel, even though we as the readers, a lot of readers more or less know how it's going to end, that scene. They know it's going to end with the banning of the Librarius and so on. It's trying to make it, even though you know that, you're still kept guessing at some aspects of it. You're still curious to see how it plays out, even though it gets to this certain point. I mean, that's the heresy books in a nutshell. I mean, ultimately, we know it ends at the Siege of Terra and ends the way it does, with, not spoiling it for anyone who hasn't got that far. But what makes it interesting is the journey along the way of the things that you learn that you didn't know before, or the deeper resonances behind certain moments that you thought was this, and it's like, oh wow, it was that. If these guys there was all these other pieces moving around the board influencing it, and if they hadn't done their small little thing over here, it would have had a big ramification over there. That's sort of a theme that runs through, and I'm jumping ahead here, a theme that runs through the Crimson King is about how just the tiniest of actions, the tiniest difference one way or the other, which at the time might look utterly inconsequential. It's, I stepped one step left instead of one step right, but take that far enough and that tiny difference widens out to become this massive change. Because I think that's, when they're talking about building the pyramid in the Crimson King, how the engineering, the tolerance that they have are so fine, because when you're building something of such scale, even like a micromillimeter out at the base will result in structures being way off when you get to the top, and they won't meet. But that's, a sort of metaphor for the Thousand Suns and the heresy as a whole, and how we planned out the stories for it. Because
speaking about
tiny actions.
speaking about that as well,
No,
it's the moment with, because I noticed obviously Magnus delivers his amazing, his basically the allegory of the cave speech, which I did want to ask about how that incorporated into the story, but I think the more important question about it relates to, it's a very different tone to it, because if I just heard that in isolation, as many readers, you think it was like the most uplifting and amazing thing ever, but it's juxtaposed with the realization of like the cracks starting to show with Magnus, because when Ahriman, looks into him and he discovers something perhaps truly horrific about what Magnus has maybe done to the rest of them.
He's done already.
It was again because obviously throughout this book, there's a few things which are like, maybe not everything is quite pitch perfect, and then this is the big moment in which you discover possibly something truly horrific about Magnus, and then he goes on to deliver something in which is meant to be filled with hope and inspiration. And obviously, knowing as the reader what you know before he goes into that massive, Colosseum to deliver it, it has a different tone in a way, because it's almost like it turns it into a lie, which I thought was really quite amazing. But then again, like, you can get sucked into a character delivering something so passionate, and then you get to remember like the context behind which,
that's why you have to watch Demagogues.
Yeah, he's the future.
He can tell a great speech.
Bloody, blood is made on the path Magnus walks. Though, I did have a small question that I think people begged me to ask this forever. Though, I'm not expecting a long answer to this one though, but I just have to do it for the community's sake.
I'll try and deliver a short answer.
Did Magnus do nothing?
Do anything wrong?
Love it.
He did a lot wrong. I mean, there's a joke essentially in the writing of the ending at 1,000 Suns, where there's the road to the pyramid. We're going back to, I don't remember the name of it, but there's a road that leads to the pyramid, and each one is etched with a good saying, and it's like, lovely, good, inspirational quotes on all these paving stones that you walk to get to the great library. And it was very much a kind of, the road to hell is paved in good intentions. And that was very much, like Magnus was trying to do good things. He wanted to educate people to the things that he knew, to see what he had seen, and that is taking the story of Plato in the cave, but taking it to its furthest extremes, and all the unintended consequences of him trying to do what he thought was right, but screwing things up even more as he did it, because he didn't know everything. Despite what he thought, he didn't know everything, and he didn't know, if he had, he would have known better than to do some of the things that he had done. So I think he tried to do the right thing, but the wrong ways of doing it. The method he chose to warn the Emperor came from a good place, but ended up screwing everything up when he smashed open the gates of the golden doors. Because I still think, ultimately Magnus was forced into heresy in the sense of he thought he was playing four-dimensional chess, but he was actually, playing beginner's checkers with the chaos gods. That they had manipulated him by appealing to his vanity, appealing to his hubris, his quest for knowledge, and they breadcrumbed the cookies all the way down to his damnation, where he made the decisions that ultimately, doomed him, because, his sort of Shakespearean flaw was thinking that he knew everything, that he could know better than everybody else, and ultimately that, is what leads him to making some very questionable choices in terms of how he did things. But the intent was there for good. The methods poorly chosen that eventually backed him into the corner where in his mind, he had no choice but to side with Horus and the other people who turned against the Emperor, even though I think he didn't want to. There's a scene in, again, we're jumping ahead again, but there's a scene in Fury of Magnus in the siege sequence where, again, I try not to spoil it, but Magnus is offered a choice, and it's the choice where he could have everything he had ever wanted, but the cost of it was too great for him. So by the time he'd been maneuvered into this position, it was a place where he couldn't take the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the world, because it would have meant leaving his sons behind.
I do have a.
So I think ultimately he was good. He had a good heart, but he just went about everything in a terribly bad way.
I think to what must have been, because I always wonder how people get to the point where they're ready to. I think of like the murder of Balik Uthazar, who's going to warn the rest of the Thousand Sons, and I think it was one of those parts in the book that was like, if it was a perfect encapsulation of, it was childlike panic within him.
Yeah, literally.
That shows that, you know, he maybe has good intentions, but the things that Magnus is willing to do to preserve those good intentions may be utterly horrific. Though, God, that one hit hard. I was like, not ready for it. Because
Magnus at that point was at a place of acceptance in some ways. Like, you know, he recognized I screwed up. I've blown things so badly. I deserve to be punished. But then even that last little bit of you where it goes, yes, I did the wrong thing, but there's still a bit of you that wants to go, yeah, but I had good reasons for it. I did the thing. You know, everybody tries to justify bad decisions they've made. You know, we all do it whenever we've done something wrong. And even if we're apologizing properly, there's still a bit of you that still goes, yeah, but I did the thing because for whatever good reason you think it was. And at that point, when Uthazar comes in, he's almost like, you know, Magnus has devised this sort of grand operatic atonement of falling on the sword for him and his legion. But at the last minute, you know, and he doesn't want Uthazar. He's like, this is my big moment, you know, my great redemption and atonement, and you're going to spoil that? No. And that's, you know, because he's got this big plan of how it's going to play out, and Uthazar is going to screw that up. So he stops him in the most, you know, unfatherly way possible. And ultimately, that's the moment. I wanted it to be a sort of echo of what happens with, you know, in the battle barge with the Emperor at the end. It's the death of one small, you know, in the grand scheme of things, insignificant person is the thing that opens somebody's eyes to, oh shit, that's not good. No, we should not be doing that. So when he kills Uthazar at that point, and he realizes eventually, when he finally does say, okay, we're not doing this, we're not doing our grand gesture of atonement, Uthazar's death is the moment that starts that thought process for him to go, actually, no, I am going to fight back. I am going to stand with my sons and not let them be crushed by Russ and the wolves.
Man, Lehman Russ always deserves to get it, in my opinion. But I had a moving on to, because I'm not giving spoilers for all the books. There's mostly moments from each of these books that I've always found myself drawn to, and briefly just through the Crimson King and Fury of Magnus here, just to tie it in a bow. The Thousand Sons and the Planet of Sorcerers, obviously, they're kind of transposed within the warp. The Legion is broken. And I thought, particularly in this book, it must have been an incredibly big challenge to where you're now essentially in the playground of gods, monsters, and a place that doesn't really have rules. And I imagined that must have been a massive challenge for writing a book that's set in the warp. And I wonder what other things you maybe, how you felt about it, and basically the challenges of writing a thing in which it's not material universe, but the warp itself.
That's like a blank canvas. It's a great feeling where you can effectively do anything. I mean, the warp is all things. It is a churn of emotion and power that could create and destroy anything in the blink of an eye. So literally anything you could think of, you can do and, you know, quote unquote, get away with. So no, it wasn't challenging in the daunting sense. It was challenging in the sense of, okay, what can I do that would hopefully live up to the infinite potential of what the warp can do and offer and become. It was just fun to tell a story that had to deal with the consequences and the fallout of the raising of Prospero. Because one of the things I always wanted to address is that, you know, the almost like the PTSD that the Thousand Sons are going through from having their legion basically broken, their world burned to ashes, and they are now like, wait a minute, are we the bad guys? Wait, what? but we've only ever tried to do good things and educate people and show people the potential that they have inside them all. Well, how are we the bad guys? So them dealing with that and the warp, being in the warp with those kind of emotions churning in your brain is a very dangerous place to be, because you are very much open to the temptations and the seductions. Because when you're in a emotionally vulnerable place, often that's when you make some very poor decisions, and that holds true for all of them as well. And then dealing in Magnus' side of things, having everything he thought he knew just ripped away from him, having been broken in the back across the knee of one of his brothers, having everything he hoped to achieve in his life just destroyed, burned to ashes literally around him. The psychological damage to him, as well as the physical damage of being, busted by rust. Yeah, and I thought, well, what would that be like for a psychic being? And the idea, the tagline in my head when I was pitching the story to Nick was like, imagine what would happen if Superman got Alzheimer's, because essentially he's falling apart. His mind, his most valuable, prized thing in all the universe is his mind and his intellect, is crumbling around him. It's falling into pieces, and that terrifies him. That's, to him, without that, he's nothing. He's just a big, strong guy. Who cares? He's a genius. He knows everything. He's read every book in existence. He knows everything that he can think to know, and that's falling away from him. And he's willing at this point to do anything to stop that from happening. And whenever you get into a point where you will do anything for a thing, again, that will drive you to make some very bad choices. As you see that every day in the news. Yeah, so
particularly
it was fun to explore.
Particularly with this one as well, because I imagine it was challenging as well. You have to essentially, what was within one novel, turn Magnus's self-sacrifice and love for the Emperor into what I, as a reader, experienced was an overwhelming sense of fear and resentment that the grand sacrifice was not necessarily the grand sacrifice he thought it was. And then to the point in which, the one who, obviously from, again, like the parent and child dynamic, his resentment of the fact that, boundaries being placed upon him by someone who does know better, but yet the child within him cannot quite accept that someone could know better, and he's just not able to
exactly
come to terms.
Well, that's what children they're basically built to do, is push the boundaries. For a while, as they're growing up, you give them boundaries that they should not and cannot and must not step beyond. But ultimately, as they get older, it's kind of the job of youth to push those boundaries, to break them, to transgress, to step over them, to learn where the new boundaries are, and so on. And that's that plays into a lot of that, because when Magnus was effectively spanked at Prospero, now he's looking to go, well, where are my boundaries now? If the things I tried and wanted to do aren't working, and the person I thought I was is not who the person I loved most in the world thought I was, and they were trying to keep this from me, it absolutely breeds resentment, and comes into that place where he's like, well, if you won't have me, then I will be just for myself. It turns to selfishness for Magnus at that point, which, he comes out of that to a degree until he gets that, final choice later on. But at that point, he's still sort of kicking back against what was done to him. He's still in that sort of heat of resentment and anger in the Crimson King before he goes through that, the 7 stages kind of thing, and comes out the other end of acceptance.
Speaking of the kind of end, the last sort of big question, which is like the end of his character arc, which I imagine, like, on a side note, must have been very interesting just to write a character in which you're essentially writing the downfall of someone who do you feel like as an author you are taking away some of the better parts of who he is, or you're sort of unveiling, is it more mask off in sense, like you're revealing the actual thing underneath it? And I did a certain phrase, this is from Echoes of Eternity, obviously later in the Siege of Terror, but it was one of those moments which I thought maybe revealed what perhaps you had thought of the true Magnus all along, which obviously is by another author, but it says, why do you speak to me as if I were a lonely pawn in this game of regicide. The War Master and the Emperor both know I am the most valuable piece on the board. It was amazing point as a reader to hear that, because I was like, oh, is that the real Magnus? And I just wanted to ask, what do you think about that?
I think he thinks he is, and a lot of people thought that. Maybe, it reminded me a little when I was watching, again, spoilers maybe, but season 2 of House of the Dragon. Like Daemon Targaryen, all through the whole season, he thought he was the player. And it was when he goes to Harrenhal and Alice Rivers is showing him the various visions of the future and so on, and he sees some of the things that are to come, and at that point he realizes, I'm not a player, I'm a piece on the board to get other things to come to pass. I'm not the prince that was promised. I'm not the most important man in the world. And that's at the point where he kneels to Rhaenyra. So there's something of that to it, that I think even at the point where Magnus is at in Echoes of Eternity, when he says that line, he's coming out of his like grief and resentment, and now he's back to that point of arrogance where he thinks, I am, no, screw you guys, you're all wrong. I mean, Magnus there's always been an edge of arrogance to him because of the things he knows, because he feels he's cleverer than everybody else. That a creeping sense of superiority came over him piece by piece, inch by inch, but he gradually became to think of himself as, I'm the most important man. That's why they were all courting me. That's why Chaos worked so hard to get me destroyed. That's why the Emperor is making this offer to me. Or he did make that, because that moment was previous to Echoes of Eternity. So I think he was back in that place of grandiose self-importance where he now believed, well, they wouldn't have been making all these efforts to try and woo me to one side or the other if I wasn't the most important piece on the board. But even then, even at this point, I think he's still trapped in a level of self-delusion to think that that's who he is, because he isn't. He likes to think he is. I mean, he would have been a hugely important piece, but the game was never about him.
Do you think was it more in the interpretation that obviously this is beyond the point in which he's accepted chaos into his heart? He's
accepted that he has no choice but to accept chaos.
I wonder if this was the point in which is chaos in a way accentuating that, like it does with most things, it accentuates that very worst part of him, and maybe within himself he's not 100% like, that's the only reason, but that's that's what chaos does.
A lot of what we were thinking, some of the thinking that went into, like, we discussed a lot of the nature of chaos. What is it? What does it do? Why? Blah blah blah, and so on. And one of the analogies that came out in the room was the chaos is essentially like the amorphous version of the One Ring, because the One Ring, it accentuates the things about you, like, or the rings of power, I should say, accentuate the thing that already exists within you. Like the dwarves suddenly, became ever more avaricious for gold and mithril. The elves became ever more distant and aloof. Men became ever more malleable and corruptible, and the hobbits essentially are kind of invisible to the rest of the world, quote unquote invisible, but the ring actually makes them, Frodo and Bilbo, invisible. So I think chaos, to my mind, that's how I've always approached writing it, that it accentuates the good and the bad within you, and often the people who are touched by it are much more prone to the bad side of things, and especially mortals, mortals whose hearts are so easy to corrupt, that are so malleable and childlike essentially in their desires. Chaos has a, relatively speaking, easy job of twisting them to get what they want. So I think a lot of the Primarchs who fell were the ones who were exposed to chaos at just the right moment, when it would appeal to some part of their psyche that wanted it, whether it was the vanity, the arrogance, the hubris, the bloodlust, whatever traits they had. It got them at exactly the right moment to make that tiny, this is the sliver of water that cracks the rock. It was that tiny little crack that allowed it in and allowed it to just
Fester.
slowly grow that thing within them that was always there. So, perhaps if Chaos had got to Guilliman or Dorn or the Khan at just the right moment of their emotional vulnerability, whatever, it maybe would have got them too. I mean, maybe that's why the only way they could have got Horus was by first weakening him on Davin's moon with the plague weapon, the anathema, and so on. That was only at that lowest of his low points was it able to find a way in, because otherwise, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe if Horus hadn't been wounded, maybe he wouldn't have fallen. I mean, that's the thing. There's so many lovely what ifs that the Horus Heresy offers us. That what if Guilliman had turned bad? What if the Lion had turned bad, or whoever else? Or what if Perturabo had stayed loyal? Imagine Perturabo and Dorn behind the walls of the palace.
Oh, no.
Would anybody have got in at that point? Probably not. A gnat probably wouldn't have got past their defenses.
I think in community-wise, because this moment is quite a culmination of essentially, again, me and many others, we followed that whole character arc to that point, and we found it really shocking. And I think it's why the debate still goes on in the community of the whole meme of did Magnus do nothing wrong, because he's so he's so sympathetic for so much of it that a lot of us find it hard to believe, and then we don't necessarily believe at the end, or at least in my own canon, that that's the sum total of who he is. But it's more about how Chaos stripped all the sympathetic character that we believed in, the one that didn't necessarily couldn't forsake his sons, is essentially swallowed up by what is the accentuated worst characteristics of himself. And it's such a nice tight bow on it, because it's in a way Magnus himself is a cautionary tale, at least it feels like that to as a reader. He very much is someone who I was you just get annoyed at him because you're come on, it's so close to being
don't do it. But that's how you get that emotional reaction. You let the characters come within touching distance of the thing that they want the most in the world, and then you snatch it away from them in the worst possible way.
Was that gutting to write? Trigger, when you have to say goodbye to a character.
Some of it, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, writing the scenes of Horus in False Gods, where he ultimately makes the choice, because that was the thing. He always wanted to make sure that he makes a choice. It wasn't like he accidentally tripped and fell into chaos. He didn't. He made the choice. I mean, Chaos cleverly showed him a truth, but then led lies towards it. So that, when it shows him the vision of the statues of the loyalist Primarchs and the others are hooded, and he's why am I not there? So it's you're not there because in the future you turn traitor, so of course your statue's not going to be there. But them not putting it there in the vision is it drives him towards making the decision that will ultimately result in that future. So it's, that's the best lies are the ones with a kernel of truth to them. And I like what you were saying about the idea that Chaos ultimately strips everything that is good from them, and it's almost is it revealing the true core of the evil at the heart of him, whatever. And it's because it appeals to you, giving you the thing that you think you want, the best of yourself. But then once it's got you, it strips all that away and leaves just the bad parts. Because ultimately, I think all of us, none of us are entirely good, entirely bad. Everyone has the capacity for amazing goodness and terrible cruelty within us, every single one of us. And I don't think that any sort of ultimate cruelty that is revealed in Magnus is that's who you were. It's just that's the part of him that is all that's left. Once it strips away the good parts, it leaves that one because it wants you to be that. It wants you to see that you've gone bad and know that this is all that is left of you. I mean, that Chaos enjoys that. The idea of, it's not just that you turn bad, it's that you are aware of how bad you've gotten and what you have lost in yourself, because that's even more painful.
The capacity to evil is depending on the person who was corrupted, I always feel like. So, with Magnus, was he's the ultimate champion because he's the ultimate fool in some capacity.
Yeah, I mean, the ones who become the most terrible villains are the ones who could have been capable of the greatest good. I mean, that goes back to like Arthurian stuff, like Lancelot was the best of them. He was the best and the greatest of the Grail Knights. And ultimately he is the one to, him and Guinevere betray the circle of the Round Table, and Arthur's the oaths of loyalty. So if it's Joe Bloggs in the corner, who was a bit of a dick anyway, falls, it's like nobody cares. But when it's Horus as the right-hand man of the Emperor, then it means something. So to go circle back to feeling bad about writing bad things happening to people, and so as a writer, that's glorious. You love those moments because it's a real moment of change. You see something that's is going to have an emotional impact on the character and the readers, and that's delicious. You live for those moments in a book. But I felt bad doing the ones for Horus because Dan had done such an amazing job in Horus Rising and making it and reminding us how awesome Horus was. Because, we look at him from a 41st millennium perspective. Horus is a byword for treachery, betrayal, spitting on your oaths of loyalty. He's the ultimate bad guy. But Horus Rising did an amazing job of reminding us, Horus was awesome. He was a great guy. He was funny. He was clever. His men loved him. They would have followed him and did follow him into hell. And we think, what a great character. What a lovely... And you get to the end of the first book, goes, I hope nothing bad happens to Horus because I really like him as a character. So I read that going, God, I've got to follow Dan Abnett, which is a hard act anyway. And B, I've got to take this amazing, charismatic, heroic, beautiful character and turn him to the dark side, essentially. And that was... I wanted to, you're writing and you think, maybe just this once, maybe there's a way he gets out of it. And you're like, no, I can't, you can't do that. You can't do that. So, but yeah, no, writing those moments, they can be, when it's a beloved character you've had a lot of fun with, certainly killing them off certainly can be tricky in the sense of, you write in the outline that they die, but then when you come to write that scene, you're like, I don't want to do that because I've come really attached to them over the writing of them. But generally speaking, when you've got a powerful moment like that of somebody falling or making that ultimate, whether it's in False Gods, it was when Horus kills Petronella Vivar at the end, the Remembrancer. That to me, that was the moment that I did not like writing that part because that was a horrible, just cold, brutal moment. And even though she was a bit of a pain in the neck of a character, that was kind of deliberate to make her an annoying character. So that when she dies, partly you're something, no. I mean, I didn't like her, but I didn't want that to happen to her. And it's killing this unarmed mortal woman just with a casual break of her neck. Felt like it was like, you're not the man we knew from earlier in this book and the previous book. You have no.
Well, on the other side of that coin, there was that scene about Magnus saving these civilians in the Siege of Terror as well, which was, I think it was almost like I imagine you purposely did the inverse to make what was the next scenes more tragic, which is, you ripped my heart out. But just, I would say like that was very much the kind of overarch of my thing. I only have one small question at the end, which is kind of tying this all up, which is, why is mankind obsessed with myth? It's a very general question here.
That's a big, again, that's not a small question at all.
But it's so 40k
myth, I think, because myths were, they were ways of making sense of the world way back in the day. It was a way of imposing order, and it was a way of imparting like morals and lessons to people by showing cautionary tales of somebody who did, like nursery rhymes are all, the ones you first learn are all about, children going out into the world, experiencing something dangerous, but returning home to the safety of their own family. And as you get older, the stories become about the children who go out into the world and then find their prince or princess and start their own family. They're tailored to impart lessons to us. Originally they were, and to impose a certain order in the world. And I think that's something that we as humans crave, the notion that there's an order to things, that the universe isn't this chaotic jumble of random things. I mean, that's a very Lovecraftian horror kind of thing, that the idea that we are insignificant specks of cells that have somehow clumped together on this rock spinning through space, and we are utterly insignificant in the face of the universe. That's a scary thought. So the idea that myths build a world around us that makes sense and that which we are at the center of is comforting. And it's, humans, we love stories. We've been telling stories since the dawn of time to one another, and mythic stories give us that sense that we are part of something bigger, that there's higher powers, for want of a better word, whether it's gods or fate or whatever it is that you hold to. So I mean, it's a big question that we could do the whole podcast just on that question alone.
I often think about it's why, in a way, I wonder in myself, it's why. So I maybe have thought about why other people are drawn to so many other different stories or faiths or other things, and I realize perhaps in myself, I'm very much in the exact same way drawn to 40k, in which I'm experiencing a real-time myth in front of me. We're talking about Primarchs and gods and emperors of mankind, and I think with these characters, it's almost a thing where I always wonders why it grabs people so much. And I think it might just be in a way it's something intrinsic about 40k in which it speaks to the human sense of myth and obsession.
Well, the scale of these stories is very mythological. It is gods among us and so on. So it's like a modern day retellings of Paradise Lost or the War of the Titanmaki, the War of Gods, and so on. We're telling essentially the same stories that the ancient Greeks and Romans told to one another. To them, these stories are of ancient history, of primordial times before the present that shape the today, and that's essentially what the Horus Heresy is. It's the primal story that shaped what the Imperium of the 41st millennium will become. So everything about these stories, from the names, the themes of the stories, some of the mythologies that's incorporated into them, it's modern mythology. At the end of the day, it's weaving stories of a mythic, ancient, grandiose, over-the-top, operatic past that would be ridiculous and insane if it ever walked among us now. But it's because it's kept in that far distant past that gives us that sense of a scale of where things were and where we've come to and where we could go.
It's a hard thing to explain, because when I'm asked about Warhammer, I'm very much trying to explain how, in a short, succinct way, it's awesome, gut-wrenching, and yet beautiful. And I think that was obviously, being conscious of time, I would say that was very much my last question. But I would say thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and also just for generally writing stuff that has given me hours of entertainment. I'm a big fan of Thousand Suns.
Pleasure.
I hope to read more of your stuff if you do anything in the future.
I'm sure you will. I mean,
thank you so much.
I'm looking forward. I've got loads more stories left in me, so hopefully I will get to tell them. And yeah, this is a pleasure chatting to you. I can talk books and stories and characters till the cows come home. So I'm sure we'll do it again sometime.